In this video, we're going to take a look at Pilot 100th Anniversary Pink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is a pale ink that, for me, can be too light most of the time. It does shade very nice in just about every pen. I just need the tone to be a little darker in general. It's very well behaved, which is okay and kind of expected for a Pilot ink. I'm just stuck at, in general, I don't care for this particular pink. It's so pale that it can frequently be difficult to read on the page. The day of writing with this ink was really saved by that diplomat arrow. Otherwise, I would have been just absolutely frustrated, no other word for it, by how pale this ink is. And it's so easy to not really be able to read what you're writing. And that's a problem when you're talking about writing. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Diplomat Arrow with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine nib has no feather, no spread. It does shade quite a bit throughout. Now it's coming through on the camera looking at it a little bit darker than I'm seeing in person. The medium is a tad bit darker than the fine. I would prefer the medium tone over the fine. The medium has no feather, no spread, very nice shading throughout all of its writing. And we're going to see a lot of that here, that it has no real issue shading. The stub started darker, and I really liked it on that first word, but the pen had been sitting for a day before I did it. And once it got writing normal, it was not a stub, that oblique italic. It was incredibly light and really difficult to read and frustrating. I'm going to say that a couple times here. Looking at the back of the page, it's a very pale ink, and for that we get no ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Mr. Pen Italics Chaplin's Tankard with an oblique italic nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. The fine nib has no feather, no spread. It does give some shading. I like the tone much better on this paper. I think it's two things that are being involved here. One, I think the toned paper is darkening the ink a little bit. Also, it's a bit more absorbent than the Clairfontaine, so I think we're getting a better color here for it. Now the medium is about the same tone as the fine, with no feather, no spread, very little shading. When you look at Leonardo, you can see it there where it goes darker to lighter to darker, and it does that on known as well, and quite a few words. The shading is very subtle, but definitely there. The oblique italic, it's much lighter than everything on the page. It has no feather, no spread, lots of shading, which is nice because the shading lets you know that there is some writing actually there, because a lot of it is just coming across as too pale to comfortably use. Looking at the back of the page, you do get the tiniest bit of ghosting, but no bleed whatsoever. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine, we're getting the best tone that I think we're going to get today. It's darker, but it is slightly red leaning. It has no feather, no spread, great shading the entire way through. Every word is showing some darker and lighter areas, which is pretty nice with this. The medium, strangely, is a little bit lighter than the fine, with no feather, no spread, still gives pretty good shading. Not as good a shading as we were getting with the fine, but it's definitely there and really working well with this much more absorbent paper. That italic nib, oof, issues. I think the issue is really me, though. There's one common issue here. Now, it has no feather, no spread. It is giving some shading, but it is a dry italic. And with that, it's really light. And there's parts that are, if I wasn't writing it, I don't know that I could read it. Further, I don't know if I return to it in a month if I could actually read it. It's bad. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Very nice. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get some shading that's going on when you see that conclusion and that has a lot of shading going on in it. That thing, lots of shading. Not a lot of shading in other areas, but it does show up from time to time, definitely giving a little bit of character, but it's very pale on this paper. Now the medium is about the same tone as the fine, with no feather, no spread, even less shading than the fine was giving, although there is little bits of it. Here's the funny part, is that oblique italic. It is, in general, writing as a darker tone. In general, it's the darkest tone on the page. Not at the very beginning of it, but once I got going. It had no feather and no spread. Really, the best use with that pen for me here. Looking at the back of the page, we get almost no ghosting and no bleeding. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Flamingo Pink. Here is Geherban Rose Tendresse. Here is Pilot Cosmos. Here is Waterman Radiant Pink. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. The fine nib has no feather and no spread. Very good. It does give quite a bit of shading, a bit more shading than we've seen on some papers. I think this paper is giving its actual best performance. While I liked how it did on the Leuchtterm and I liked how it did on the Moleskine, I think this cheapest paper with this ink is doing very well, even though with the toned papers, it was coming across as a little bit darker. The medium is lighter than the fine with no feather, no spread. It does have some shading spots that are showing up, but just a few of them. The italics, it's got a little bit of feathering that shows up at the words craving and for and fame, so there is tiny feathering that's occurring. Not the end of the world here. We're not really getting spread. We are getting some shading and a lot of color variation because the pen is very dry, and with a more absorbent paper, kind of sucks some of that ink out as you go, which makes me worried about the bleed. And yet, still, we get almost no ghosting, more in the fine than anywhere else, and no bleed through that touches the page underneath, so great job. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Diatramentis Robert Louis Stevenson, South Sea Blue. Here is a turquoise ink by Montegrappa Their Turquoise. Here's a blue-black ink by Noodler's, 54th Massachusetts. Here is a black ink by Platinum, Black. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The fine nib has tiny feathers, but really very small and not worth being a big deal. It does experience a little bit of spread, but again, not a big deal with this ink. This is readable on here. It is not too light to be able to read comfortably, which is good on this paper. In general, this paper, the cheaper papers are actually helping this ink out. The medium is about the same tone as the fine with minor feathering and a tiny bit of spread, but both of those again are really not being such a big deal. We're not really getting any shading on the medium at all. It's a good solid tone the whole way through, so if that's what you prefer, you're getting it. Now on the italics, the lightest tone on the page, I don't like this. It starts getting a bit too light. It does give tiny bits of feathering, not a big deal. The spread is not bad, very manageable and under control. And the shading there actually is some darker spots when you look at the word name or you look at the question mark by Ayers. Not so bad. Looking at the back of the page, we do see some ghosting that's going on, but no bleeding that touches the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? In a dry or even a medium flow pen, it is just too light a tone to really do that and enjoy the experience. I needed a broad wet pen to kind of get over some of the frustration of this super light pink. Now, this is just far too light for me, but that doesn't mean that for other people this would not be perfect. Definitely not an ink to use in a dry italic nib or dry stub for that matter. I think it's just going to be too light to comfortably deal with. But I do think if you like very pale pinks, you could use a medium flow pen. For me, I needed a gusher and broad. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.